Hello, History 17B Autumn Quarter 2023. We are up to the Thanksgiving break when I'm recording this, probably later when you're looking at it. So you really want to keep an eye on your points from here on until you have what you want. We left off the last lecture looking at imperial conflict around the Mediterranean. I thought that we would start with the entire world for this lecture since we're heading into World War I, just to get an idea of how massive the imperial contest was. Great Britain, of course, was enormous at this point. Sun never sets on the British Empire and all of that. It had holdings in North America, South America, Africa, through the Middle East, through South Asia, and down through Australia. Some of these, like Canada, were more amicable. Queen Victoria had approved the Federation Act of 1867, although Canada would not be officially fully independent until 1982. Many places, though, in the empire, like the Indian subcontinent and most of Africa, were held under coercion. France held on to French Guiana, this little blue speck down here. There's France itself, as well as huge areas of Africa, including Madagascar, and of course, French Indochina or Vietnam. I will run through the other flags in order and you can sort out any specifics that I don't show. Spain is in this sort of chartreusey yellow-green here, Spain, and you can see they still have holdings in Africa. Portugal, they show the flag of the last monarchy. I think that actually was replaced by 1914, but I liked this picture, so I kept it anyway. The flag would be dark green and red at this point. But anyway, Portugal is dark green, and you can see that they still have holdings in the southern regions of Africa, and there's little Portugal itself. The Netherlands are in orange, and you can barely see them there, but you know about the Dutch East Indies down here. The German Empire is in this sort of dark slate color, and although it's hard to see here, it is expanding over Europe, and it also has parts of Africa over here and over here. The Ottoman Empire is in this light green, and it is smaller than it had been in previous century, but it is still relatively big in the Middle East. Belgium is black, and you really can barely see Belgium itself, but this region in Africa is the Belgian Congo, and it was one of the most abusive regimes ever. Russia is in this kind of puce or purple-brown color, and you can see it trying to spread across here. Japan is in brown, and you can see they've moved up into Korea and are trying to go into China there. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is in this sort of olive, and it doesn't look like much compared to the Russian Empire, but it is spreading across this area and into the Balkans. Denmark is in bright green, and you can barely see Denmark, and Iceland and Greenland was still held by Denmark. Norway is in this sort of purple ink color and only has a little bit of an extension up here. The US, of course, is pale blue and has Alaska, and then that continues down and into the Philippines across some Pacific islands. And Italy is red. Italy has not that long been a cohesive country on its own, but it has already moved into Africa. This lecture will take us into World War I. We will look at the history of imperial conflict very briefly and work our way around the world to the US. Then we'll look at Woodrow Wilson's policy of neutrality in his first term and consider similarities and differences in how the war economy affected the rising world powers of the US and Japan. And finally, we will see the course that eventually made the US enter the Great War. Your chapter in the YOP textbook offers a more standard blow-by-blow lead-in to World War I, and I am going to send you there to read about it. I am going to take a somewhat different road to World War I than going through the Balkans and Archduke Ferdinand. These are wars in Europe, these on the slide, from the 19th century to World War I. Or rather, since even with this small print, it takes 2 slides with 2 columns each to list them all. This slide only goes to 1862. You'll see things here like the Napoleonic Wars down here, the Russo-Ottoman Wars, starting in 1806 and another one in 1828, a couple of Russo-Persian wars, one starting in 1804 and one in 1826, and the Crimean War over here. And it's not that those are of a special interest so much as some of them are ones that you'll hear about. And you also see that you are starting to get empire against empire wars, as well as wars to take over places, and as well as revolutions and uprisings. This is 1863 to World War I. There's an Austro-Prussian War here, a Franco-Prussian War here, a Serbian-Ottoman War here, and a Russo-Ottoman War here, and so on, until you get up to World War I. My point here is that World War I came out of a long history of conflicts, revolutions, unifications, and imperial reach in Europe. This came with a host of alliances of convenience that were made and broken, as well as governments that appeared and disappeared along the way. There were open alliances and secret treaties, revolutionary governments, and old monarchies that literally were related to one another. Wilhelm II of Prussia and then Germany, George V of England, and Nicholas II of Russia were all cousins of sorts, but would end up with very different fates by 1920. Here's another way of looking at a similar idea. These are the distribution of relatives of Queen Victoria, grandmother of both Wilhelm II, a leading light of the Central Powers in World War I, and George V, prominent among the Allied powers, which the US would eventually join. Victoria was also the grandmother of Alexandra, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II. This is part of the reason that you get this extraordinary cascade of events in 1914. July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. August 3rd, Germany declares war on France. August 4th, Britain declares war on Germany. August 6th, Austria declares war on Russia. You can also see where Japan gets pulled in. August 23rd, Japan declares war on Germany. August 25th, Austria declares war on Japan. And of course, the US, although the US held off officially joining the war until 1917, declaring war on Germany in April and Austria-Hungary or Austro-Hungarian Empire in December. I also want to point out that just because imperial powers declared war on one another, it does not mean that everyone in those empires agreed to just go along and wait out the big war before asserting their own issues. I will point out in particular the Easter Rising here in 1916, and of course the Russian Revolution and ensuing civil war, or perhaps more properly, civil wars. The list actually continues. I just cut it off at the bottom of the slide. With all of that in mind, here is the view of Europe in 1914. So now you get a better view of the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You can see that Bulgaria, Romania, Greece hanging out here in the Balkans region. You can see Denmark a little bit better here, and the Low Countries, Netherlands and Belgium. And you can see the Russian Empire looming over everything, and the Ottoman Empire just peeking up from Asia Minor here. These maps represent imperial holdings in Africa and the Middle East in 1914. Note that in Africa, only Liberia on the west here and Ethiopia in the east are not claimed by European powers. In the Middle East, we can see the near continuity of British claims from Egypt through the Middle East and into South Asia. The Ottoman Empire, as I mentioned before, is smaller than it used to be, but it still covers Asia Minor and a good bit of the Middle East. A refresher on Asia and the Pacific from last lecture: Japan has Korea and Taiwan and is edging into China, although it's hard to see here. France has Vietnam. China is now labeled the Republic of China. Russia is looming in from the north, and the US has the Philippines. We've seen the Dutch East Indies as we zoom from the Philippines south here. We can see German claims in Oceania, and of course, British claims extending through Burma, the Malay Peninsula, part of Borneo, through Oceania, and we know down to Australia. Aside from claiming the Philippines and Pacific Islands, including Guam, Midway, part of Samoa, and Hawaii, what was going on in the US, as well as the rest of the Western Empire at this time? We tend not to think about South America first and foremost when it comes to the First World War, especially as most of South America was free of official European claims by that time. But remember that trade, resource extraction, economic ties, and corporate reach had become extremely important through the first decade and a half of the 20th century. It was not just American corporations reaching tentacles around the world, it was also European ones. During the 3 decades before World War I, Latin American countries developed their export economies, although they produced a limited set of materials for trade. Crises in the United States and European customer countries, which at the same time supplied all kinds of imports which were being cut off, impacted South America. In the months after the outbreak of World War I, European investment capital to South America screeched to a near halt, with exceptions for countries that supplied materials needed for war. By 1915, some South American countries converted their resources into profit. 10 from Bolivia, nitrate from Chile, copper from Peru, and meat from Argentina and Uruguay brought some industrial and national profit. But the general population, especially the working classes, suffered from inflation, sinking real wages, mass unemployment, and government violence in this time. In addition to this, European powers intensified blockades of the seas around South America in efforts to cripple enemy nations by stopping their access to resources coming out of South America. The Allied powers introduced so-called blacklists, just like in employment, to enforce a boycott of trade with German or allegedly German companies. This was a particularly big deal when it came to nitrates used in fertilizer in peacetime, in explosives and munitions during war. That is one of the reasons that you will see full-scale World War I battles fought off the coast of Chile and in the Falkland Islands. While the Allied powers severely limited Germany's access to South American nitrates, Germany responded by turning their already formidable chemical research to the development of synthetic nitrogen. This story is in the codas to both this lecture and the next one. The United States became the primary trade partner to much of South America. In fact, New York was the last source of capital still accessible to Latin America once World War I was well underway. This meant that U.S.-American influence in the region expanded as European influence waned. South American media began to worry about the so-called commercial conquest of Latin America by the United States as early as 1914. We've seen U.S. businesses reaching their tentacles through Central America and the Caribbean. By 1914, large U.S. companies dominated the coffee and banana industries, forcing economies in Central American countries to be centered on producing products and profits for U.S. corporations. These corporations manipulated local politics to their benefit and crushed any labor unrest. The U.S. government supported American-owned corporations with direct military involvement in a continuation of the pattern that we've seen with North American Indians and with Cuba. Some countries, notably Honduras and Nicaragua, were occupied by U.S. troops for years at a time. We've already seen U.S. interference in the region of Panama in order to build and then control a canal linking Atlantic and Pacific maritime traffic. The Panama Canal was completed and opened in 1914, just in time for World War I. We've also seen U.S. intervention in Mexico under Woodrow Wilson, including sending forces to Veracruz after hearing that Germany was supplying Mexico with arms, military arms, not things growing off of the human body. In fact, the U.S. was actually correct about German involvement with Mexico, at least. It was actually a goal of the German government to aggravate already present tensions in the Americas, particularly those involving the United States. German officials increased their military engagement in Mexico in an endeavor to reduce the risk that the United States would join the developing Great War against the Central Powers. Mexico was the focal point of German distraction strategy because of its geographic proximity to the United States and Mexico's vulnerability as it dealt with uncertain internal politics, revolution, and civil war. Also, Mexico had oil fields. In one of Germany's more brazen efforts, Arthur Zimmermann, the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, sent a telegram to Mexico via the embassy in Washington with a message so out there that many people in the US considered this story to be an Allied propaganda hoax at first. We will see this in more detail coming up, but Germany made use of submarine warfare. And in February of 1917, the British Secret Service was concerned about this and deciphered the so-called Zimmermann telegram, concerned that it might detail plans involving German U-boats or submarines. You can see the telegram here, and you can see that it is in code. What British intelligence found in the telegram was a statement that Germany was willing to join forces with Mexico should the United States decide to enter the war on the side of the Allies, and that Germany would give Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona as war booty. In the United States, the publication of the Zimmermann telegram initially met with dismissal by ordinary Americans who believed it was a forgery produced by Allied propagandists to get the U.S. to actively join the war. When Zimmermann himself, however, confirmed its authenticity, it inspired many Americans to rethink what we will see in just a moment was an extremely strong push for U.S. neutrality. Once again, I am going to send you to your yacht reading for this mini module for a good summary of U.S. involvement with Mexico under Woodrow Wilson. This chapter also does a good job of explaining that despite naval ambitions and a willingness to send troops against Native Americans, an aging Spanish naval fleet, and a Mexico in chaos, the U.S. did not in 1914 have the military resources or know-how to actually join the big imperial powers in what was turning out to be a very different form of warfare compared to anything that had come before, with submarines, chemical weapons, and dramatically increased firepower. As Europe spiraled deeper and deeper into war, Woodrow Wilson declared U.S. neutrality. He said, "The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war," which, while he seemed to forget that there were Americans with ancestors from Africa, Asia, and North America, including Mexico, did reflect the reality that when it came to many voters, choosing a side in the developing catastrophe would be tricky. Most English speakers with ancestors from the British Isles supported the Allies, but the Irish, not so much. Remember, the Easter Rising was building, that I pointed out in an earlier slide. Many more recent immigrants from German-speaking nations still had relatives in countries that were now Central Powers. Jewish Americans who had fled pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe also tended to look more favorably on the Central Powers that were fighting Russia. American progressive activists saw their quest for better working and living conditions within the U.S. threatened by entanglement in fights among European imperial powers. The cartoon on the left shows Wilson trying to steer clear of war and international intervention as he pilots the U.S. through dangerous waters. As you can tell from all of the campaign buttons, if you are watching, Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 on the fact that he had kept the U.S. out of war. So starting here, this button says, "He has kept us out of war. Wilson." The next one says, "War in Europe, peace in America. God bless Wilson." Down here, we have peace with honor, preparedness, prosperity, and Wilson. Over here, we have peace in the nation, prosperity in the state, friends of the people, and it's plural because it's including Wilson and his running mate, Glenn. And this one up here finally just says peace and has a picture of Woodrow Wilson. As I think you can see on the map, also on the slide, Wilson won the 1916 election against his Republican opponent. But keeping the U.S. neutral had been a tough job, and it was only going to get more difficult as Wilson began his second term. Supposedly, international law said that neutral nations like the U.S. should be able to trade non-military goods. But the British had set up a heavy naval blockade to keep supply ships away from Germany. The British naval blockade stopped neutral ships, including those from the U.S., sometimes confiscating items they thought might help the other side. Wilson objected, and the British returned U.S. goods or promised to compensate for them after the war. Of greater importance to perceptions of neutrality was the balance of commerce coming out of the U.S. before it ever got to the blockades. The U.S. ramped up production of farms and factories and shipped extra goods to all of Europe, but more by far went to the Allied countries than to the Central Powers. So you can see chugging along here, UK is always the biggest trade, but Germany is up here, up through 1914. France is here, Austria-Hungary is just sort of down there. All of a sudden, between 1914 to 1915, exports to the UK shoot up. To France, they nearly double or more than double. And Germany and Austro-Hungary are no longer even really visible at this scale. The same pattern appeared as American financiers made international loans. Around 2.3 billion went to Allied powers, while only 27 million went to the Central powers. As the US continued lending millions of dollars to European nations embroiled in war, the US went from being a debtor nation, owing $3 billion to foreigners in 1914, to a creditor nation. By 1919, foreigners owed the US $10 billion. The US was not the only rising industrial nation to experience an economic boom associated with wartime production and supply. Japan joined the war several years before the US, but even so, fighting took place outside of the country, leaving most of the population and critically industrial production largely untouched. World War I resulted in Japan's acquisition of territory, an economic boom, and the country's emergence as a great world power. Japan had signed a treaty with Great Britain in 1902. The initial intent was to defend against the threat of Russian expansion in Asia. And like the US under T. Roosevelt, Britain saw the Japanese Navy as a bit of a proxy to take some of the weight off of its own Navy. At Britain's request, when it declared war in August 1914, Japan mobilized its navy of about 100 warships, but it would be against Germany and not Russia. Japan's leadership calculated that the unfolding conflict in Europe presented both a threat to and an opportunity for Japan's interests. For Japan, Germany's victory in the larger war could lead to increased competition in East Asia. On the other hand, joining the Allied powers, including Britain, would allow the Japanese to increase their territory while German forces were occupied otherwise in Europe. The German holdings are outlined in brown on this map. It might not seem like they were a big deal, but they were to the Japanese. They include part of Samoa that we've talked about before in the lower right corner, along with this corner of New Guinea here, and large groups of islands like the Caroline Islands here. Zooming in on the area between Korea and the map key, we see that at the outbreak of the Great War, Germany controlled the port of Tsingtao here, located on the Shantung Peninsula in eastern China. This was where Germany based its Far Eastern Squadron. The British leased Wei Highway, I apologize for my pronunciation, as a coaling station and port. And we have already seen that Japan had taken Port Arthur from Russia during T. Roosevelt's presidency. Japan led a joint Anglo-Japanese military operation against the German forces in Tsingtao, and the Germans surrendered in November of 1914. In a sign of the changing shape of 20th century warfare, the battle featured the first ever use of Japanese seaplanes launched from an aircraft carrier to sink a German mine layer and bombard German positions. Japan emerged not only with Tsingtao, but also with German possessions in Oceania, the Caroline, Marianas, Marshall, and Yap Islands. Although it was not immediately obvious how World War I would affect the Japanese economy, especially as industrial production was really just getting off the ground, it shortly became clear that Japan would see a boom in demand from around the world as global imports shifted away from Europe, who were busy killing each other. As with the US, Japan went into the war with trade deficits, but this flipped, at least during the war. The Japanese economy grew as exports increased by 400%. Japan's export boom crossed all industries, including machinery, steel, chemicals, and textiles, although marine transportation and shipbuilding grew the most. Japan sold arms and munitions to Britain and Russia, as well as building 12 destroyers, like you see on the slide there, for France. Japanese industry constructed merchant shipping vessels for Britain and was in the process of building additional merchant ships for the United States as the war ended. Unlike with the US, Japan's economy crashed quickly after the end of the war, undergoing a major setback by 1920. Despite this, Japan kept working on research and development, a practice that would be apparent going into World War II. But we are not there yet. While the US bolstered its industrial and economic power at the same time as Japan, the US had no interest in conquering new territory with its military. In fact, Wilson was deeply concerned about the effects that European imperialism had on the state of the world, as he watched the European powers blowing up themselves and everyone else on the way. Nonetheless, the US was too deeply bound up with Western Europe, especially Great Britain, to remain neutral as the war dragged on. We've seen this with exports and financial loans, but the overall global insecurity endangered both US civilians and US trade in the long run. And both the Allied and Central Powers figured that the US would join the Allies unless the Central Powers could win the war quickly, and they did not. Germany had been developing its naval power, as we've discussed before, but they also realized that they would need to do something other than just try to catch up with the monumental British Navy. And one result of this was the Unterseeboot, I'm trying here, or U-boat, which makes my life much easier, or submarine. Technically, international law at the time held that any naval vessel firing on another must first warn its adversaries and allow passengers and crew to evacuate prior to the actual attack. Those rules pretty much dated to the kind of warfare in which you lined up soldiers facing one another on a field and told them to shoot each other. World War I changed warfare on land and sea. While the idea of only taking out the ships themselves and seeking a minimal loss of human life seems nice, it defeated the purpose of a submarine, which was stealth. Additionally, the U-boat sacrificed size and defenses for that stealth, meaning that when U-boat commanders did try to obey the rules, the larger ship intended as the target would just ram or fire on the U-boat, sinking it while it waited for folks to evacuate. So U-boats stopped warning ships before firing torpedoes. The British responded by arming merchant vessels that picked up supplies at neutral ports. Germany asked that neutral ships stay out of the war zone to avoid being mistaken for enemy ships. Both Germany and our old friend who ran for president 3 times, William Jennings Bryan, in his capacity as Secretary of State, urged President Wilson to bar Americans from traveling as passengers on ships of countries involved in combat, especially as Britain does appear to have started using passenger vessels to transport arms. Wilson responded in his idealistic way that neutrality meant that Americans should be able to travel wherever and however they wish. The result was the sinking of the Lusitania, a British liner with American passengers that sailed from New York in May of 1915. The Lusitania carried a crew of 702, as well as 1,257 passengers. It also carried 4.3 million rounds of rifle ammunition and 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells, and a German U-boat torpedoed it. Among the passengers who died were 128 Americans. You can see the Lusitania before it was sunk on the lower right here. And apparently you can still explore the Lusitania if you are a diver, or find pictures of its current state if you are not. I think this one is amazing with a light fixture they've actually found in the wreck there. William Jennings Bryan, in his position as Secretary of State, advocated holding both Britain and Germany accountable. The British for transporting arms on a passenger ship, and the Germans for sinking the ship. When Woodrow Wilson chose only to criticize the Germans, Bryan resigned. The German government apologized for the deaths of Americans and, as per Wilson's request, offered compensation to the U.S., but they also made it clear that this was a war and that they had no intention of changing their submarine strategy with respect to Britain. Wilson tried desperately to broker peace between warring European factions, but not very surprisingly, at this point, negotiations were rejected. In March of 1916, a German sub thought that it was torpedoing a minesweeper, but it turned out to be the French steamer Sussex. 4 Americans on board were injured, not killed this time, but injured, and Wilson threatened to cut off any diplomatic relations with Germany if they did not stop unrestricted submarine warfare. Kaiser Wilhelm II had just lost 500,000 soldiers in a failed assault on Verdun and really did not want the U.S. to start sending troops at this point. So he agreed to Wilson's demand to curtail submarines. This was called the Sussex Pledge. At the same time, Great Britain put even greater pressure on the U.S. by boycotting 80 American firms that were still doing business with the Central Powers. As events like this began to add up, Wilson was in a bind. As far as I know, Roosevelt didn't call Wilson a chocolate eclair, as he had done with McKinley, but he did publicly condemn Wilson for not building up U.S. defenses and military preparedness. In contrast to Roosevelt, the U.S. had a large contingent of pacifists who came out with and shared the song you see on the left, "I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier." Americans who were ready to go to war and beat up some Germans responded by adapting the song to be, "I didn't raise my boy to be a slacker." At the time of the 1916 election, Wilson tried to steer a middle course. Remember, his campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." As a policy of moderate preparedness, Wilson asked Congress to fund large increases in troop numbers in both the Army and the Navy. Having won a second term as president, Wilson went back to trying to negotiate peace. In the image, you can see a tiny Woodrow Wilson, only tiny because the whole view is so big, addressing the U.S. Senate in January of 1917. Wilson's idea was an agreement between nations to communicate openly rather than having lots of secretive alliances, limit arms buildup, and stop the practice of killing tons of people while taking regions back and forth from one another. A European pastime, as you saw from the list of wars that I showed earlier. Wilson had a vision of free world trade and nations negotiating with diplomacy rather than force. Unsurprisingly, this did not go over well with anyone in practical terms. At that point in 1917, Germany was actually doing well and planned to add territory in Eastern Europe, Africa, Belgium, and parts of France. They did not want to give up those prospects, and the Allied powers had no intention of conceding anything. The Germans at this point launched a major offensive to try to end the war before the US and Allied forces could get Wilson to agree to send troops. Germany retracted the Sussex Pledge and let it be known that they would attack all ships in waters near France and England, no matter what they were carrying or whose flag they flew. As you can see on this slide, this was not a secret kept from Americans. It was headline news. Then, in February, news of the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico hit the newspapers. And once Americans were convinced that it was legitimate, they were, of course, up at arms. Wilson asked the U.S. Senate to give the authority to arm merchant vessels, as Britain had done before, so that they could defend themselves against U-boats. Congress filibustered. Wilson issued an executive order to get that through, but by that time, Germany had sunk 5 U.S. ships in quick order. On 2 April 1917, Wilson addressed a special joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. One concern with joining the Allied forces in 1917 was what would happen with Russia, as Tsar Nicholas II had just been deposed in the revolution, and Allied powers were not certain at all what government they would be working with going forward. Nevertheless, the U.S. Senate voted 82-6 in favor of declaring war, and the House approved the measure 373-50. The U.S. declared war on Germany. Wilson, ever the idealist, insisted that the U.S. fought for principles like liberty, not for material gain, although honestly not having open shipping lanes seems like quite a material issue. Wilson declared, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Key points to Lecture 14. World War I in Europe grew out of a long history of warfare in Europe, intensified as Germany sought to become a world empire on the scale of Great Britain. European empires had claimed all of Africa, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia. The Ottoman Empire, while reduced from its former extent, was still in control of Asia Minor and large parts of the Middle East. Great Britain held massive parts of Africa, including Egypt, and then continuing in strips across the Middle East and into South Asia. In the Western Pacific and Far East, Germany, Russia, and Japan all wanted to extend their imperial territory across China. Great Britain and the US wanted to maintain control of trade with China and hoped to use the rising power of Japan and its navy to hold off other imperial powers. Great Britain and the US wanted Japan to keep sea lanes and access to Chinese markets open for Great Britain and the US. Unlike Africa, many South American nations had been able to get rid of direct imperial control, largely getting freedom from the waning Spanish and Portuguese empires. Nevertheless, the economies of South American countries depended on trade and were severely impacted by events of World War I. The U.S. had been in conflict with Mexico as the rest of the globe entered World War I. Germany sought to intensify this conflict in order to distract the U.S. and keep the country from joining the Allied powers directly. The economies of both the U.S. and Japan grew massively as they, one, filled the gap formed by the loss of European goods in international markets, and two, supplied war materiel. And that word material is not the same as material. It is spelled correctly there, and it means things like ships, ammo, and weapons. The US and Japan supplied war materiel to the warring European nations. Unlike the US, though, Japan's economy crashed in the immediate wake of World War I. Initially, the US, as a neutral nation, supplied both Allied and Central powers with goods and financial loans, but both trade and loans were heavily skewed toward Allied powers. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson campaigned for his second term as president with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Germany developed U-boats or submarines. These changed the rules of naval warfare, albeit over the protests of the Allied powers and the still neutral United States. Woodrow Wilson, right up into 1917 in his second term, kept trying to guide the European factions toward peace without success. The combination of unrestricted submarine warfare and interference in Mexico, both of those on the part of Germany, finally provoked the U.S. into declaring war and officially becoming a World War I combatant in April of 1917. The coda for this lecture is actually super long. Remember, you're not required to watch these. But this coda explains how Germany developed a path for producing synthetic nitrates when they lost access to South American deposits in World War I. This would have massive ramifications for agriculture on a worldwide scale, as well as for weapons technology on the road to World War II. Because of the length, I'm going to put half of the nitrogen discussion as the coda for this lecture and put the other half after lecture 15. Off we go. What do red clover, seabird poop, World War I, the current world population, and the Oklahoma City bombing all have in common? Nitrogen, specifically fixed nitrogen. In human hands, it has the power to nurture or to destroy. We cannot exist without it. For example, it is nitrogen in the form of an amine group, NH2, as you see on the slide, that gives amino acids their name. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and proteins are vital components of the human organism. Nitrogen is also essential to DNA and RNA. In fact, nitrogen is the fourth most common element in the human body, accounting for about 3.2% of your body weight. Multiply that by a world population of over 7 billion, and that's a lot of nitrogen tied up in humanity. Fortunately, we are surrounded by nitrogen. Unfortunately, most of the nitrogen with which we come in contact is not immediately useful to us. Nitrogen makes up almost 80% of the Earth's atmosphere, so we should be able to collect it from our breath, like oxygen, right? Well, as if you couldn't tell from the way I asked the question, in a word, no. Atmospheric nitrogen exists in an extremely stable or inert form, two nitrogen atoms linked together by a triple bond, or N2, as you see on the slide. Our bodies cannot break that bond in order to harvest usable nitrogen from the air, nor can other animals, nor can plants. So how do we get usable nitrogen? The short answer is that plants can use nitrogen from the soil if it has been what's called fixed. Nitrogen fixation means that the two nitrogen atoms have been separated and each combined with another element, like oxygen or hydrogen. For oxygen, you get nitrates, NO3, which is what plants use, and you see on the slide. For hydrogen, you get ammonia, NH3, which I haven't shown you. In these forms, the nitrogen atom is reactive or chemically available for cellular processes. Plants incorporate the fixed nitrogen from the soil, animals eat the plants, and we eat plants and other animals to get nitrogen. Great. So where does nitrogen in the soil come from? Well, it happens that although plants and animals cannot fix nitrogen, there are bacteria that can. Some of these bacteria are free-living, and some exist in symbiotic or mutually beneficial relationships with plants. So plants get the fixed nitrogen from the soil, animals get the nitrogen from the plants and animals die, and other bacteria as well as fungi degrade organic matter, returning some of the nitrogen to the soil and some to the atmosphere. Animals also poop out extra nitrogen, which is why manure can be fantastic fertilizer. This nitrogen cycle is an elegant system, but you may have noticed that it is also self-limiting. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria can only do so much. and not all plants exist in symbiosis with them. Legumes, peas, beans, and vetch, I put a picture of vetch on the slide in case it's not familiar to you. They contain bacteria which can fix gaseous nitrogen in nodules in their roots. Cereal crops, such as wheat, on the other hand, do not. Early farmers noticed that growing certain crops repeatedly in the same field would deplete the soil and the crops would stop producing well. They had no idea that it was nitrogen that was being depleted, but they figured out how to deal with the problem by allowing fields to lie fallow or uncultivated for a year or two. Human agriculture hummed along for around 10,000 years, replenishing soil with compost and manure or letting it rest, but there was an inbuilt upper limit to how many humans could exist at any one time. A shift, which was to have global consequences, occurred in agricultural practices in the 18th century with the introduction of the four-field crop rotation system to England. Now, the English did not develop this system. They imported it from Flanders, where it had long been commonplace. But the English implementation of it, combined with English imperialism, was pivotal to developments with far-reaching consequences. And on the slide, I have shown you a clover root with the nodules with bacteria that can fix nitrogen. For centuries, arable land on English manors had been divided into 2 or 3 major fields, each of which was then subdivided into strips allotted to the lord, here in orange, and the tenants in green. To deal with soil depletion, one entire field was left fallow every year. This meant that between a third and a half of all English farmland at any given time was devoted to weeds. Not only did this limit plant food for humans, it also limited fodder for livestock. Large herds of cattle could not be kept alive through the winter, and it was customary to slaughter many every autumn and preserve the meat. In the four-field system, as the name suggests, land was divided into 4 major fields, which were not subdivided into strips. Each field was planted with a single crop, and no field was left fallow. One field would be planted with wheat, another with turnips or Swede rutabaga. When it says roots, that's what it means, is root vegetables. A third with barley or oats, the last with clover. The crops would be rotated each year so that in the course of 4 years, each field had grown each crop once. The genius of this system was that not only were all fields productive at all times, but turnips and clover, if you were wondering how clover could be a crop, provided winter fodder for cattle. And clover, which exists, as you saw in the root picture, in symbiosis with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, replenished the soil. Farmers could keep larger herds of livestock, allowing them to experiment with breeding bigger and bigger cattle. More food could be produced, which meant that more people could be fed, but it also meant an end to individual peasant farming and communal fields. As the proportion of the workforce needed for agriculture fell in England, workers were freed up for or pushed into, depending on how you view things, labor in service and critically in industry. This was a complex and multifactorial process, but it is not a stretch to say that clover, with its nitrogen-fixing bacteria, lay at the root of the first industrial revolution and budding British hegemony. Yes, I couldn't resist those puns. By 1850, as the British Empire expanded dramatically, only 22% of the British labor force actively engaged in agriculture. This was a smaller proportion than in any other nation in the world at that time. Industry would lag in other parts of Europe. Crop rotation with cover crops like turnips and clover was very much akin to what we would now consider sustainable organic agriculture. It produced enough food to support the spark of the first industrial revolution, but not enough to sustain the growing populations of 19th century Europe and North America. Even with crop rotation, soils were being depleted when another source of nitrogen came to the rescue. If the Industrial Revolution was rooted in clover, global empire rested on bird poop. Europeans first encountered the thick deposits of bird droppings called guano in South America at the beginning of the 19th century. And when we say thick deposits of bird droppings, we are talking thick deposits. Rich in accessible nitrogen as well as phosphates, guano had been used as fertilizer along the Peruvian coast since before the Inca. In 1840 to 41, a consortium of Peruvian, French, and English businessmen made a huge profit by mining 8,000 tons of guano and exporting most of it to England. By 1858, England was importing more than 300,000 tons of guano a year, and the ammonia-scented resource had become Peru's leading export. Other countries also imported significant quantities of guano. By the middle of the 19th century, the USA, France, and Germany all relied heavily on it as a nitrogen source. In fact, South American bird poop was so critical that it showed up in American President Millard Fillmore's 1850 State of the Union address. He declaimed, quote, "Peruvian guano has become so desirable an article to the agricultural interest of the United States that it is the duty of the government to employ all the means properly in its power for the purpose of causing that article to be imported into the country." Not surprisingly, enterprising businessmen sought other locations to obtain guano. One result of this was the passage of the Guano Islands Act of 1856, which effectively sanctioned U.S. imperialist expansion in the quest for bird feces. In the following decade, the United States would use this act to justify claiming 59 islands, the majority in the Pacific, as overseas territory. These are ones that we don't hear about very much. It's not like Hawaii or even Wake Island, but these are islands that the U.S. claimed and that it actively began heavily mining guano from. Even as Peru's economy came to depend on guano export, Europe started to exploit another source of usable nitrogen found in South America. The Atacama Desert along the Pacific coast west of the Andes Mountains contains high-quality deposits of sodium nitrate, NaNO3. Free-living bacteria in shallow salt lakes had fixed the nitrogen, forming a band of deposits 30 kilometers wide and 700 kilometers long. You may recognize sodium nitrate from the ingredients list in preserved meats like bacon, salami, and hot dogs. But as the 19th century progressed, the vying world powers had more critical uses for nitrates. Here on the left, I have a picture of Chinese workers mining guano in the Chicha Islands of Peru, and you can see just how deep these deposits are. The way that nitrates were deposited in the Atacama Desert looked more like this. By the second half of the 19th century, scientists knew that fixed nitrogen was the limiting factor in soil, and that nitrate fertilizer was essential to maintaining agricultural production in countries like Germany and Britain that had overfarmed their soils for centuries. Of equal interest to industrial nations, nitrates, when combined with sulfur and charcoal, form explosive black powder. By 1868, fueled by European capital, nitrate mining in the Atacama Desert was booming, and it would change the political geography of South America. When the first 700 tons of nitrate left South America in 1830, The nitrate fields were shared by Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. As exports increased, so did boundary disagreements, which exploded into the War of the Pacific in 1879. This bloody conflict lasted 5 years and ended with Chile victorious and in possession of the vast band of nitrate deposits. Chile profited hugely from the export taxes on nitrates. They accounted for 43% of Chile's government income by the 1880s and a whopping 68% in 1894. But the nitrate industry itself was largely foreign-owned. The British Empire, Germany, and the United States controlled over 3/4 of Chile's exports at the end of the first decade of the 20th century. Of these, Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany, with its sandy, overused soils and formidable industrial capacity, was the largest importer of Chilean nitrates in the world. And this brings us to the eve of the First World War. We saw World War I battles around South America in the main lecture. The Battle of Coronel, which opened on 1 November 1914, was one of the earliest naval battles of the war. It happened off the coast of Chile as British and German fleets vied to control the region's critical trade routes. The Germans destroyed the smaller British fleet stationed there and briefly cut off essential nitrate shipment to the Allies. The British responded by dispatching a huge naval force, which defeated the German fleet at the Battle of the Falkland Islands in December and reversed the situation. From 1915, the British, in association with the U.S., controlled Chilean nitrate supplies, cutting off Germans pretty much completely. So, how did Germany keep going until the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, when World War I ended? As is often the case with historical questions, the answer depends on a confluence of events, not a single factor. But once again, nitrogen proved a key ingredient to Germany's ability to keep going in World War I. And we will look at that in the coda to the next lecture.